So the topic of today's lecture is Introduction to Network Science. So we're going to talk about the plans for this module, and we'll do some introductory, I'll talk about some introductory material. So first of all, a few class technicalities. My name is Leonid Zhukov, and the TA for the class will be Andrei Shestakov. The course will consist of 2 modules, and each module will have 10 lectures and 10 labs, and Andrei will be taking care of the labs. So far, the schedule is the lectures we'll have on Thursday from 6:10 p.m. until 9 p.m. Here is the website where you'll find all the information about the lectures. There are also material, there are papers available there, and you will also, the homeworks will be posted there. My emails is lzhukov@hscru, and Andrei's email is also given. In terms of programming, we'll be using Python, and in particular, we'll be using IPython notebook, and we'll be using NetworkX as a main library. Well, in fact, you could possibly code a lot of things yourself, but for efficiency reasons, we decided to stick with NetworkX. And for some large networks, it will be good to use external software to visualize them, and we'll use either Gephi or YED visualization software. Finally, most of the lectures will be online, and we'll be using Zoom meeting software. So what are the prerequisites for this course? Well, first of all, it's discrete mathematics, it's linear algebra, algorithm data structures. It would be good if you have some probabilities theory, differential equations. And we do require skills programming in Python. You will not teach that, though we'll have some introductory material for IPython if you never used it. From linear algebra, we require some basic knowledge, which are vectors and matrices, operations on vectors and matrices. It would be good to know about sparse matrices and the type of storage used for sparse matrices. And finally, eigenvalues and eigenvectors. Now, eigenvalues and eigenvectors we'll use a lot, and if you don't remember what that means or how to find them, please look it up. From graph theory, we'll need some main concepts. So what graph is. We'll talk about various types of graphs, which are directed, undirected, simple graph, weighted graph. You'll need to know what connected and strongly connected component of the graph are. We'll talk about paths and cycles in the graph. We'll talk about shortest path, about trees. So these are all sort of main fundamental concepts that you learn in discrete mathematics and in the algorithm class. There are several algorithms that are also critical for us. It's breadth first search, depth first search algorithm, algorithm for finding connected components, and shortest path. Again, if you don't remember them, please check them out. In terms of textbooks, well, right now there are several very good books out there. First of all, we'll be using a lot of Mark Newman's introduction, Networks Introduction book. There is a very interesting book on networks, crowds, and markets, though that book is probably more oriented more towards social scientists, and it is less strict in terms of mathematics used in there. There is a very interesting book on social economic networks by Matthew Jackson, and there is absolute classics by Stanley Milgram and Catherine Faust on social network analysis. Where I will provide references to certain chapters in that book. And there is a very nice book on network analysis and the methodological foundation. This is actually a collection of articles, but they are these articles are on the sort of fundamental aspects of the computations with networks. There are also several very, very good and detailed reviews. The first one is a review by Albert and Barabashi, Statistical Mechanics of Complex Networks. It's Well, it's pretty dated for right now, but it's probably still one of the sort of the best and the biggest reviews. The alternative is a review by Mark Newman, Structure and Function of Complex Networks. So links to those are available on the class website. So what are we going to do this module? We'll have 10 lectures, and here's the plan. We'll do Introduction to Network Science today, and we'll talk about the problems network science deals with and some major properties of complex networks. Next lecture will be devoted to power laws, and we'll talk about all kind of power laws and their role in network theory. Third lecture will be about random graphs and R-Rani models of random graph generation. The fourth lecture is about small world and dynamical growth model. These are new models that scientists came up with 10, 15 years ago. Then we'll switch a little bit and talk about some metrics and measures on the graph. And first of all, we'll talk about centrality measures and the notion of node centrality and the importance of the nodes and ranking of the nodes. And we'll talk about link analysis, or what role links play in centrality, in the node centrality. And we'll discuss here PageRank and HITS and other modern algorithms for web graph analysis. Lecture number 7 will be about structural equivalence, or about finding similar nodes in the network, similar in the sense of their roles, and so which means connections in the network. And then we'll spend the last 3 lectures on network communities. We'll talk about the definition of various definitions of the communities. We'll talk about algorithm that allows us to detect communities. We'll talk about graph partitioning as a way to find communities in the network. And we'll talk about specifically design for community detection, algorithm specifically designed for that. So that's a short plan for this module. Module 4 will be devoted to processes on networks, diffusion, etc., etc. This module we mostly dedicate to analysis of the structure of the network. So network science is a very new science. It's actually probably, if you start looking for referrals, you will not find things earlier with the name network science. You will not find things earlier than year around 2000 or late 90s. But in fact, network science is formed from various well-established sciences. So first of all, it's sociology, and sociologists used to do social network analysis, or SNA in short, for quite a long time. Actually, in fact, since 1930s, though the networks they dealt with were pretty small, right? It's the network that you can get from collecting data by hands, really. Mathematicians, they did talk about graphs for several centuries, and in fact, in mathematics, there has been a breakthrough, and a pretty much new field appeared in 50s and 60s with R-Rani introducing random graph theory. Computer science has been dealing with graphs a lot. Graph the data structure and developing algorithm for the shortest path, shortest path algorithm, and other algorithm flow methods. Statistical physicists, they kind of jumped on this wagon in the late 90s with notion of complex networks and networks being part of the complex systems. And physicists study complex systems, or complicated, interacting systems with a complex interacting patterns. Economists also talked about networks and a lot of pairwise interaction. And there is finally biologists, it's bioinformatics, it's about interaction between protein-protein interaction and many other things. So as you notice, these are very, very different sciences, and each of them bringing its own approach, and in some sense they're complementary, but sometimes a little bit contradictory in the sense that we'll see some terminology that is different, and it really depends on where it came from. Methods and definitions and algorithm will be different whether it came from, say, biologists, economists, or computer scientists or mathematicians, and you will feel that slight difference. So the difficulty of this course is to put all this knowledge together and make it usable with whatever applications you have in mind. So first of all, as I mentioned, terminology thing, well, as you have seen already, I've been already using the words network and graph. Well, in fact, it's the same. In network and graph, it's a set of nodes or vertices collected by links or edges, right? So network is the same as graph, and when we talk about nodes, very often we'll use the term vertices or nodes interchangeably. But let's say if you look at the social sciences literature, most likely will be about actors. Links, edges, again, well, social sciences will come up with relations. We could talk about communities or network communities or network clusters. So all this different all the different terminology, well, eventually you'll have your hands on it. So if you look at this picture, you'll see here separate nodes of vertices or actors, and they're connected by edges. Okay. So what's complex network? Well, again, first of all, network is a graph, and so it's a collection set of nodes collected by edges. We'll talk a lot about what it means for network to be a complex network. But just sort of a few ideas, by looking at this picture, you realize that on one hand, this network is not regular. Not regular in the sense, every node has a different number of neighbors, has different connectivity patterns. But at the same time, it's not random. You can see that there is some structure in this network. For example, you realize that there is something similar sort of at the ends here, right? And whatever in the center looks different. So there is a structure, but it's not a regular structure. And the topology or the pattern of the connections is very non-trivial. Now, these networks have very, very, very specific properties. It's what's called scale-free networks, and we'll talk about it in the next few minutes. But what's amazing that doesn't matter where these networks come from, social sciences or from transportation or economics, or it's even brain networks, they have a lot of universal properties, which means they're very similar. And that's amazing. And they describe it's a complex system in the sense that, first of all, there are complicated patterns of pairwise interactions. And the other important property that you really need to study the network as a whole. If you decompose it into pieces, well, you will lose the whole thing, because network is about connection between nodes. And if you cut it into nodes and edges, you lose everything. And this is, in fact, what what physics of complex systems studies. It is the system in general, and not decomposition into pieces. So here are a few examples. Here is the internet, a wonderful picture from 2003. It's internet traffic routing, where every node is a router on the internet, and edges are connections. There are actually quite a few connections in this picture. Well, in fact, visualization of networks is a science by itself, and though there are a lot of algorithms that allows us to visualize networks, it's actually very hard to build meaningful picture. And though this, for example, picture is extremely beautiful, it's not quite clear how to actually use it, except for showing that the internet is very, very complex objects. I'm not sure if we can extract any more information just from looking at this picture. Another example, this is a blogosphere. There are blogs. Every node here is a blog. Red nodes, colored red, are conservative blogs, blue are liberal, and there are links between them. Red links are between links from conservative blog to conservative blog, blue from liberal to liberal, and orange and purple are links in between them. And if you don't, so here is, it's in the very center right there. There are orange and purple linked. So, for example, in this picture, you can, though it also looks like a mess, but you can clearly see this polarization of political blogs. You see two clusters or two communities, liberal community and conservative community, and the communities citing each other a lot, right? Referring to each other a lot. Here's another example from social sciences. This is a Twitter, and this is what's called hashtag diffusion. Well, if you use Twitter, you know what it is. And well, hashtag is just a way to reference particular topic. And when you use Twitter, you can either retweet somebody's tweet or use mention. And here is a propagation of particular hashtag. Well, in this, from this paper, it's USA hashtag, how it was retweeted. And you realize that there are some people who actually retweet to a lot of other people, right? And some people has very, very small retweets. Here is another very interesting example. This is example where the nodes are financial institution, and there are a lot of sort of banks that you, of course, recognize. You know, here's your Goldman Sachs, and here's your Merrill Lynch, and there's Fidelity Management, and it's Barclays, so et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And there were connections between them, and connections mean sort of lending or borrowing money. And you realize that the financial structure is very convoluted, and pretty much, if you're looking at this, banks are all interconnected. So, you know, from the point of view of network analysis, it might be interesting to find out, okay, well, what's the stability of the system? What happens if, say, one of the banks goes bankrupt, or which of those banks are central or important to this? Here's another great picture of this visualization. Well, this is like actual map of the public transportation. Again, here nodes will be stations, and edges will be connections between those stations. I believe there is all kind of means of transportation shown here. What makes this graph a little bit different from what we have seen before is the fact that it can have parallel edges. So there are some edges. Well, if you think about edges as a means of transportation, that you'll still have some of them running in parallel, right, in between stations. So there is like parallel edges in there. Here is another example now from biology. These are protein-protein interaction network in yeast. Again, you sort of realize that on one hand, the structure here is really not regular, but at the same time not very random. Organizational networks, this is just a structure of some fictional organization, how people interact in that organization on various business purposes. And finally, beautiful pictures on the Facebook communities. Here, different colors correspond to different communities. Visualization done with Gephi. And say this is like the one of probably the most famous visualization of the Facebook, of the friendship graph of 500 million people, just showing how, you know, world is interconnected. So you have seen all those examples, and I promise that there are a lot of things that are common in between those networks. So there are several features I would like to talk about today. So first of all, all these networks are so-called power law networks, or in other words, they have power law node or vertex degree distribution. Another word for that is scale-free network. So we'll talk about it today what exactly that means. Another property is a small diameter or average path length of this network, the fact that these are small world networks. And the third property is the fact that this network have very high clustering coefficients, or what's called transitivity, or in other words, number of triangles. So they're very, very much triangulated. So these are three properties that are very much characteristic for complex networks. Pretty much most of the networks that occur in nature and those that we're going to study, whether they're social, political, biological, technological networks, they will all have these properties. So what's power law? Again, we'll have an entire lecture devoted to it. But to give you an idea, let's take a look at this network. This is a history of philosophy network where different philosophers are connected if one of the philosophers follows their theory of another. And if you notice, if you look closer on this picture, you realize, well, yes. Oh, and the number of the size of the node here, every node is a philosopher, and the size of the node is really just the number of connections, or pretty much the number of the students for the philosopher, the followers of that philosopher. And if you realize there are not that many of those big philosophers, right? There was Aristotle, there was Hegel, Immanuel Kant, amazingly Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, right? And then there are smaller. The Plato is little. It's also among big ones, and there are more of smaller philosophers. Now, the characteristic here in this picture is that there are very few but very large philosophers, and there are lots and lots and lots of small philosophers. So there is very, very uneven distribution of the number of followers for philosophers. Here's another zoom in. You'll see here Aristotle, and you'll see Plato, and there was like lots and lots of smaller philosophers. Well, we don't even have names here for them. So what does this node degree distribution mean in a scale free network? Well, the idea is the following. Let's just calculate number of links or number of friends every node has, and just count how many of those nodes are in the network. So here we'll have the number, we'll show number of nodes in the network, and on the horizontal axis will be the connectivity. So how many links they have. And so here we'll have, hundreds, thousands of links, lots and lots of links. But there will be very few of those. At the same time, in a graph, we'll have lots and lots of nodes with a few links, with a small number of links. So that will create a very, very uneven histogram or distribution, and it's called power law distribution. We'll talk about it more on the next lecture. If we compare that distribution to the distribution we would expect to have from random process, that's what's shown on the left side. We'll realize that it is very, very different. So in a typical process, you'll have lots of nodes with approximately the same number of neighbors, and you'll have some distribution, bell-shaped distribution, with exponentially small number of nodes with a larger number of neighbors and smaller number of neighbors. So in some sense, say the heights of people in the world distributed according to this bell curve distribution, which is, we have average height, and there are people who are a little bit taller, and there are people who are a little bit shorter. If human race, the height of human race were distributed according to power law, then we would have very few, but would have people of height, 10 meters, 20 meters, etc. and lots of very short people. So which is not true. So for example, human height is distributed according to bell curve, but number of friends in the network is distributed according to power law. There are people that have lots and lots and lots of friends, and they live here on this edge of the distribution, but there are not that many of those. Think about them as celebrities. They might have lots of friends and lots of followers, but majority of the people are actually on this end of the spectrum, this end of the histogram. There are a lot of those people. They're very typical people. They have very few friends. So that's called power law, this particular type of the distribution in terms of number of friends, number of connections, links per node. Clustering, as I mentioned, clustering, the idea of clustering, high clustering or transitivity. It really means that if we're talking about social networks, that if you have two friends, what does probability that they know each other? And we know that in social settings, the probability is very, very high. So it is very high because of many reasons, because you usually meet new people through your friends. Because you meet people through your friends, and because it's much easier for people to get introduced that way. So if we look at this graph, for example, at this geometric graph, now this graph is, by the way, is not a social network. This is just for an example. I showed a geometric graph, which is generated by randomly putting points on a plane and connecting them in a certain fashion. But I just wanted to show, to emphasize, that in this graph, there are lots of triangles, right? And so because of that, the clustering coefficient or the transitivity of the network is high. And the transitivity is just the ratio of number of triangles to the total possible number of triangles in the network. And here is actual Quattro network, which is a social graph friendship network where people are connected if they write papers together. And if you look at this graph, you realize that you'll still seeing lots and lots of triangles. Right? There are triangles everywhere. So it happens that a lot of social networks, and in general, complex networks, will have pretty high clustering coefficient. They'll have a lot of triangles in them. And final property, which is a small world, it has another name, which is called 6 degrees of separation. You probably heard this phrase, and it really means that any two people on average separated by no more than several connections. In fact, this idea for the very first time was proposed by Frigyes Karinthy. It's Hungarian author in his short story in 1929, but it came back into sort of people's opinion in John Laguerre play which is called 6 Degrees of Separation, and the movie later on. Though among scientists, this idea among social scientists that the world is pretty small was circulating since late 60s. And in fact, there is a very famous small world experiment done by social psychologist Stanley Milgram in 1967. His paper shown here, it's called titled Experimental Study of Small World Problem. And so here is the idea of this study. Milgram recruited volunteers through the newspaper and asked them to participate and send them out the following instruction for the participation in the study. So the idea was to be able to send a postcard from a person, to send a postcard to a person that is in other located somewhere far away. And particularly in his case, he was doing experiments, sending postcards from Nebraska to Boston. But the goal was to actually send a postcard through the friends if you do not know by name their addressee of this card. So here is instruction that were given to the participant of that experiment. If you know the target person on a personal basis, so you know him, mail the card, the folder directly to him. But if you do not know, do not contact him directly. Instead, mail this folder to a person who you think might know him. So the idea was to try to figure out if we really have a small world, if we really can pass the message across this world, and just try to count how many steps it's going to take for these letters, folders, to actually find the addressee. So here is a setup of experiment. They had recruited 196 volunteers in Nebraska, and 100 people in Boston, and the target person was actually in Boston. And so this is a target area over there, Massachusetts, Boston, and the goal of the experiment was to actually see how many steps it would take for the message to get from Nebraska to Boston. If the letter is sent only to people that know each other on a first name basis. And before the experiment, the answers were very, very different. A lot of people assumed that it would probably take 100 steps, and the letter will never make it through. Now, the experiment was quite tricky because they tried to measure several things. So they wanted to measure not only the path through which things go, but they want to actually experiment with different channels. Channels in the sense that they provide not only the name of the person who is addressee, but also his profession. And so in some sense, you can, if you think about how you would locate a person somewhere, you can go through several channels. You can think of finding someone who were born in the same town as this person, or finding someone who lives in the same town, or maybe finding someone who has the same profession. And so we might have different channels based on professions, or based on their place of birth, or etc. And to make it a clean experiments, they also looked into sending these letters also from Boston. So it goes from Boston to Boston, but just to make sure that if that works, compare the length, the number of this intermediate steps the letter is going to take. So the information that was given was the target name, his address, occupation, place of employment, college, hometown. And here are the results. Amazingly, 64 letters, or almost 30%, reached the target. Here is a picture, the diagram, histogram actually, showing the number of chains, or number of the number of the chains of particular length. So if you look at this, you realize that here is how many there was, like around 7 chains of length 5. So it went through 5 people. There were 14 chains of length 4, right? And there were probably 16 chains of length 6. So average chain length was 5.2. Now, if you notice this the distribution, we'll call it bimodal these days, right? So it has 2 peaks. And the reason is because it happens that the letters, you could classify the letters as going through 2 different channels. So one of them went through the channel, through the sort of hometown channel, so where people tried to send the letter through the people who might lived or born in the same town. And business contacts went through this sort of business contacts chain. It's interesting to see that a business contact chain, business world, happened to be smaller, right? And of course, from Boston, it was shorter. But still, it took only 6, on average 5.2 steps, 5.2 intermediates to deliver the letter, which is amazing because people assume that it might take hundreds of people to be able to reach this unknown person. So there was an experiment that proved that we're actually living in a small world. That this notion of 6 handshakes that separates people is on average is more or less a reality. Of course, this experiment, I mean, with the development of the internet, people wanted to repeat this experiment. And Nicholas Watts reproduced this experiment in 2001 by sending 48,000 letters, email letters, asking to forward email to some person. It was pretty much the same setup as Stanley Milgram experiment, and he calculated that on average it took 6 forwarding to get the email to the right person. Now, interestingly here, the response rate, of course, is much lower. And I mean, you can imagine, if you get an email asking, please forward it to a friend, so who might know somebody in Boston, well, most likely it will go to junk, right? But in 2001, there were still people who actually participated in this experiment. Again, this was repeated by Julie Skovic on the Microsoft Messenger graph with 240 million users, and they got an average diameter of the graph, average length of the graph is 6.6. And finally, it was reproduced by Lars Beckstrom at Facebook with even more users, and they actually found out that Facebook is a much even more smaller world than expected. So it's only 4.7 steps away. And if you look at this, you can also clearly see that it is shrinking. It's especially well seen on a graph for the United States users, right? So the maximum is shifting to the left. So the Facebook world is getting smaller. It's also true for the entire world. It's just not that clearly seen here. But with time and the density of the friendship on the Facebook increases, and average path length is getting smaller. So it is a small world after all. Now, if you have not thought about it before, it might sound weird. Now, how is this millions and millions of people? It takes only 6 steps to reach every person in this world. Well, here is a sort of idealistic, very, very naive model, very simple, but it can give you an idea why this might work. Now, we're going to make very significant and very wrong assumption. We'll assume that the friends that you have do not know each other, right? Now, in fact, they do, but for a second, let's just assume that they do not and see what happens. Let's look at this graph. Let's say this is you, and you have 4 friends. Okay, so you have 4 connections, and each of those friends have 4 more friends, except for you. So in fact, from the graph point of view, that this node degree is 5, but so there's 4 extra friends here, and each of them has 4 more friends, etc., etc., etc. So you have 4 friends. Each of your 4 friends has 4 friends. That means on this 2-step distance, we already have 16 nodes, and on a 3 steps, we have 64 nodes. So if a person has Z friends, on average. And then let's say, okay, z to the power of steps will give us the total number of people that that will be connected in the world after d steps. Well, if z to the power d is equal to n, then d is log n divided by log z. And logarithm is an amazing function. If you take n to be 6.7 billion, the Earth population, and let's say on average, every person has 50 friends, then in fact, d will be 5.8. Okay, so it is 6 with these assumptions. Now, if you have not 50 friends but 100 friends, it will be a little less. If you have less friends, it will be a little more. And of course, we made a very, very strong and very wrong assumption that these people do not know, that your friends do not know each other, and so these are different people, and so that your network, the connectivity growth extremely fast, exponentially fast. But still, it gives you an idea that if you have that many people, and each of those of your friends, that many friends, and each of your friends have that many friends, and each of your friends have that many friends, that in only like in 6 steps, you literally cover all the entire population of the world. So it's really about the structure of the network. If we live not in this type of world, but in the world where that is dominated by regular graphs, let's say the friendship structure would look like that, with a regular lattice, then the average path in between, the average path length on this thing will be proportional to, say, square root of n, if we're talking about a two-dimensional world. And with 6 billions, 10 to the 10, so it's 10 to the 5th. So it'll be huge, and it is not. So our world is really structured. Our friendship and connectivity patterns are really much more have more of this structure than this regular grid thing. So, I hope this give you some sort of idea and flavor of the topics we're going to talk about in this course. We'll start working from the next lecture in more details on ideas of power law networks. We'll talk more about the clustering. We'll talk about more of the ways networks are structured, how they grow and change with time. But for right now, here's a few references that's reading to get started. There are several reviews, short reviews, popular reviews on articles that will help you to get started on this topic. And there's several historical papers. The paper by Stanley Milgram, original paper, and then the paper with him was Jay Travers, and there are a couple newer papers on the scale of the web. Well, this is it for today. And please, if you remember, we started with discussion on linear algebra and graph properties and graph analysis. And if you're not very comfortable with those, please spend some time and refresh those ideas. Well, that's it for today.